In the rolling hills of rural Alabama, where cotton fields stretch toward distant tree lines and the air hangs thick with humidity and history, there stands a place that time forgot. The Grayson Homestead sits like a wound in the landscape, its weathered buildings casting long shadows across barren earth that refuses to grow anything green. The farmhouse, once grand, now sags under the weight of decades, its white paint peeling like diseased skin. But it's not the house that draws your attention. It's the barn rising from the red clay soil like a monument to something unholy. The barn dominates the property with a presence that feels almost alive. Its wooden walls, darkened by age and weather, seem to absorb light rather than reflect it. Local folks have learned to avert their eyes when they pass by on the old county road. They've learned not to linger after sunset, when strange sounds drift across the fields and shadows move in ways that shadows shouldn't quote to dot. The stories began in 1892, whispered first in general stores and church pews, then spreading like wildfire through the small communities that dot this forgotten corner of Alabama. Families would disappear, they said. Entire bloodlines would vanish without explanation, leaving behind only empty tenant shacks and unanswered questions. The authorities would file reports, neighbors would shake their heads in sympathy, and life would move on. After all, times were hard and poor folks often packed up in the night seeking better fortunes elsewhere. But the disappearances always seemed to center around one place, the Grayson Farm. Families who took work there would arrive with hope in their eyes and desperation in their hearts, willing to labor for whatever wages old man Grayson offered. They would move into the small cabins scattered around the property. Their children would play in the dusty yard. Their wives would tend small vegetable gardens behind their homes. For a while, everything would seem normal. Then, one morning, the cabins would stand empty, doors left ajar, meals half-eaten on tables, clothes still hanging on lines, as if entire families had simply evaporated into the Alabama heat. The local sheriff would ride out, ask a few questions, and invariably conclude that another family had moved on without saying goodbye. It happened more often than people cared to admit in those days. What people didn't talk about, what they couldn't bring themselves to voice even in whispers, were the other details. The way dogs would howl all night before a family vanished. The strange lights that would flicker in the barn windows when no one should have been inside. The smell that would drift across the fields on certain nights, sweet and cloying and wrong, in ways that made your stomach turn. Old-timers still remember their grandparents' warnings. Don't go near that barn after dark. Don't look too long at those windows. And if you hear singing coming from inside, you run. You run and you don't look back. But warnings, like memories, fade with time. By the early 1900s, few people remembered why they avoided the Grayson place. It simply became part of the landscape's unspoken geography. A place where your horse would shy, where your children would fall silent, where the very air seemed to press down on you with invisible weight. It wasn't until 1934 that the truth began to surface. A fire had damaged part of the barn's roof, and the county sent inspectors to ensure the structure wasn't a hazard to passing travelers. What they found inside would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. In the dim interior, stacked like cordwood against the walls, were bodies. 22 families worth of men, women, and children, arranged with careful precision in the barn's shadowy depths. But here's what made grown men weep and strong women faint: the bodies hadn't decayed. 40 years had passed since the first disappearances, yet the flesh remained intact. Not fresh, but preserved in a way that defied all natural law. Their skin had taken on a leathery quality, stretched tight over bones, while their hair remained full and lustrous. Their clothes, though faded, showed no signs of rot or insect damage. It was as if death itself had been suspended within those wooden walls. The discovery sent shockwaves through the county and beyond. Newspaper reporters descended on the small town like vultures, their headlines screaming of mass murder and supernatural preservation. Scientists arrived with their instruments and theories, trying to explain how human remains could survive decades without the usual process of decay. They tested the soil, analyzed the air, examined every inch of the barn's interior. Yet, for all their measurements and hypotheses, they could provide no satisfactory explanation. The barn wasn't particularly dry or cold. The soil showed no unusual chemical composition. There were no natural preservatives present, no environmental factors that might account for such remarkable preservation. The bodies simply existed in a state that challenged everything science understood about death and decomposition. But this raises a question that still echoes through these hills today, a question that no amount of scientific study has ever been able to answer satisfactorily. To understand the horror that would unfold at the Grayson Homestead, we must travel back to its origins, to a time when the land itself was young and the sins that would stain it were only beginning to take root. The Grayson family arrived in Alabama in the 1840s, riding the wave of cotton prosperity that drew ambitious men from across the South. Jeremiah Grayson wasn't content to be just another planter. He had grander visions, darker appetites that would shape the very foundations of his empire. Jeremiah came from old Virginia money, but his wealth carried whispers of its own. His grandfather had been known for strange practices, for workers who vanished from his tobacco fields, for rituals conducted under new moons that neighbors pretended not to notice. The family had always walked the line between respectability and something far more sinister. Their prosperity built on methods that decent folks didn't care to examine too closely. When Jeremiah purchased nearly 1,000 acres in Alabama, locals were impressed by his immediate success. His cotton grew fuller and whiter than anyone else's. His livestock thrived even during harsh seasons. His workers, though they came and went frequently, seemed unusually productive during their time on the farm. What people didn't discuss were the other details. The way Jeremiah's crops flourished even during droughts that devastated neighboring farms, or how his animals never seemed to fall prey to the diseases that plagued other herds. The barn was built in 1847, constructed by workers who arrived from distant counties and departed quickly once their labor was complete. It was an unusual structure, larger than necessary for storing crops, with strange architectural features that served no obvious agricultural purpose. The foundation was laid in a peculiar pattern, with cornerstones positioned according to some design that local builders couldn't understand. Windows were placed at odd angles, and the interior space was divided by walls that created chambers rather than simple storage areas. Jeremiah claimed the barn's unique design was based on advanced European agricultural principles, methods for preserving grain and protecting livestock that he'd learned during travels abroad. But the workers who built it told different stories in the taverns before they left town. They spoke of strange symbols carved into the wooden beams, of spaces beneath the floor that seemed designed for purposes other than storage, of a feeling that the building itself was watching them as they worked. As Jeremiah's plantation prospered, so did the whispers about his methods. Tenant families would arrive seeking work, drawn by promises of fair wages and steady employment. They would settle into the small cabins scattered around the property. Their children would begin attending the local schoolhouse, and for a time, everything would appear normal. But neighbors began to notice patterns that troubled them. Families who worked for Jeremiah changed. The women became withdrawn, speaking less frequently in town and avoiding eye contact with old friends. The men developed a hollow look in their eyes as if they'd seen things that had drained something essential from their souls. The children, once playful and bright, would grow quiet and watchful, flinching at sudden movements and shadows. More disturbing were the sounds that drifted from the Grayson property after dark. Low chanting that might have been prayers but felt like something else entirely. The rhythmic beating of what could have been drums but sounded more like heartbeats echoing across the fields. And sometimes, on moonless nights, witnesses claimed to hear screaming that would suddenly stop, as if cut off by something more final than sleep. The local preacher tried to visit the Grayson Farm once, concerned about the spiritual welfare of the families living there. He returned pale and shaken, refusing to speak about what he'd witnessed. He left town within the week, telling his congregation only that some sins were too great for earthly forgiveness. His replacement was careful never to venture onto Grayson land, content to pray for the souls there from a safe distance. By the 1880s, Jeremiah had passed away, but the farm continued under the management of his son, Ezekiel, who had inherited more than just land and property. The disappearances that had begun as isolated incidents became more frequent, more systematic. Entire families would vanish within weeks of arriving at the farm, leaving behind only empty cabins and belongings that would eventually be claimed by the advancing kudzu. Yet the barn remained active. Lights would flicker in its windows long after sunset, and travelers on the county road reported seeing figures moving inside, shadows that seemed to dance to rhythms only they could hear. The structure had become something more than a building. It had become a repository, a collection, point for something that defied natural order. But the question that haunted those brave enough to ask it remained unanswered. If the Graysons claimed their barn was for storing crops, why did it never smell of grain or hay, but always of something sweet and cloying that made your throat close and your stomach turn? The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical darkness. One family here, another there, each disappearance separated by enough time and distance that no one connected the dots until it was far too late. The McBride family arrived at the Grayson Farm in March of 1898, 5 souls seeking a fresh start after losing their previous home to debt. Thomas McBride was a skilled carpenter, his wife Sarah a seamstress of considerable talent, and their 3 children, aged 6, 9, and 12, were known throughout the county for their quick minds and easy laughter. The family settled into one of the larger tenant cabins, the one with the red door that faced east toward the rising sun. Sarah planted a small garden behind their home, growing tomatoes and beans and the yellow flowers she loved so dearly. The children enrolled in the one-room schoolhouse down the road, where they quickly became favorites of the teacher, Miss Crawford. For 6 weeks, the McBrides appeared to be thriving in their new home. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late April, Miss Crawford noticed the McBride children were absent from school. It wasn't unusual for farm children to miss classes during planting season, so she thought little of it. But when they failed to appear on Wednesday and then Thursday, she decided to visit their home to check on their welfare. She found the cabin empty. Not ransacked or hurried, but empty in a way that made her skin crawl. The breakfast dishes still sat on the table, food partially eaten and now attracting flies. Sarah's sewing lay abandoned in her rocking chair, the needle still trailing thread as if she'd simply paused mid-stitch. The children's books were scattered on the floor near the fireplace, open to pages they'd been reading the night before. Most disturbing of all was what remained in the garden. Sarah's flowers had been picked clean, every bloom severed at the stem and arranged in careful circles around the empty flower beds. The vegetables, too, had been harvested, but left to rot in neat piles beside the cabin's back door. It was as if someone had methodically erased every sign of growth and life from the family's small sanctuary. Miss Crawford reported the disappearance to Sheriff Hawkins, who rode out to investigate. He questioned Ezekiel Grayson, who expressed appropriate concern and surprise. The family had been excellent workers, he said, reliable and hard-working. He'd had no complaints about their conduct, no disputes over wages or living conditions. They'd simply vanished in the night, taking nothing with them, leaving behind a mystery that had no satisfactory explanation. The sheriff's investigation, such as it was, revealed nothing. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, no indication of where the family might have gone. Their wagon remained in the shed beside their cabin, their few possessions undisturbed. If they'd left willingly, they'd taken nothing with them. If they'd been taken against their will, whoever had done it had left no trace. But the McBrides were only the beginning. The Weston family disappeared 3 months later, followed by the Colemans, then the Harpers. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. Families would arrive seeking work, settle into their assigned cabins, begin building new lives on Grayson land, then simply vanish without warning or explanation. The few neighbors brave enough to pay attention began noticing other details. Families who worked for the Graysons changed in the weeks before their disappearance. The adults would develop a hollow look in their eyes, as if they were seeing things that drained the hope from their souls. They would speak less frequently, in town, avoiding conversations with old friends and keeping their children close at all times. More unsettling were the reports from travelers who passed by the farm after dark. They told of seeing lights in the barn windows when no work should have been taking place, of hearing sounds that might have been machinery, but felt more organic, more alive. Some claimed to have witnessed wagons pulling into the barn in the dead of night, loaded with what appeared to be sleeping figures, but morning would reveal no trace of these nighttime activities. Local physician Dr. Marcus Webb began keeping unofficial records of the disappearances after his own suspicions were aroused. By his count, between 1895 and 1905, 43 families, comprising 187 individuals, had vanished from the Grayson property. Not moved away, not relocated to distant states, but vanished as completely as if they'd never existed at all. Dr. Webb attempted to interest state authorities in the pattern, but his concerns were dismissed. Rural families moved frequently in those days, officials reminded him, seeking better opportunities wherever they might find them. The fact that so many had worked for the Graysons was coincidental. The farm employed more tenant families than any other property in the county, so naturally it would account for a disproportionate number of departures. But Dr. Webb had noticed something else, something he documented in his private journals but never reported to authorities. Every family that worked for the Graysons developed the same symptoms in their final weeks: loss of appetite, disrupted sleep patterns, a peculiar pallor that seemed to come from within rather than simple malnutrition. The children would stop playing, the adults would move as if walking through thick water, and all of them would develop an aversion to direct sunlight that bordered on the pathological. It was as if something was slowly draining the life force from these families, preparing them for whatever fate awaited them in that ominous barn. Dr. Webb's final journal entry on the subject, dated October 15, 1905, contained only one line: "God help me. I believe they are still alive in there, preserved like specimens in some hellish collection." He left town the following week, selling his practice and moving to Mobile, where he lived in terrified silence until his death 30 years later. But his journals remained, hidden in his former office, waiting to corroborate what investigators would eventually discover: that the barn wasn't just a storage facility, but a tomb where death itself had been suspended, where missing families had been arranged like offerings to something that demanded preservation rather than decay. When the county inspectors finally broke the rusted locks and pried open the barn doors in 1934, the smell hit them first. Not the stench of death and decay they'd expected, but something far more disturbing. A sweet, preserving scent like flowers, left too long in stagnant water, mixed with something chemical and wrong that made their throats close and their eyes water. The sunlight streaming through the doorway illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. But beyond that initial shaft of light, the barn's interior remained shrouded in shadows that seemed too thick for natural darkness. Inspector Harold Morrison, a man who'd seen his share of grisly discoveries during 20 years of public service, took the first tentative steps inside. His boots echoed on wooden floors that creaked with age, and as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he began to make out shapes along the walls. At first glance, they appeared to be bundles of old clothing, carefully stacked and sorted. But as he moved closer, the horrifying truth began to reveal itself. They were bodies. Men, women, and children arranged with meticulous care along the barn's perimeter. But these weren't the skeletal remains or rotted corpses that Morrison had expected to find. Instead, the bodies appeared almost lifelike, their skin drawn tight but intact, their hair lustrous and full, their clothing faded but undamaged by time or insects. It was as if death had visited these people and then simply stopped, preserving them in a state between life and decay. Morrison, S partner, Detective Ray Coleman, stumbled backward when he saw what they'd discovered, his face pale with shock and revulsion. In his 30 years of police work, he'd never encountered anything that challenged his understanding of mortality so completely. These bodies should have been bones and dust decades ago, yet here they lay, preserved in conditions that defied every natural law he thought he understood. The arrangement itself was deeply disturbing. The bodies weren't simply stacked or dumped, but positioned with deliberate care. Families were grouped together, parents flanking their children, hands positioned as if in prayer or supplication. Their eyes, though sunken, remained intact beneath closed lids, and their expressions held a serenity that seemed almost peaceful, if you could ignore the unnatural preservation of their flesh. Dr. Margaret Ashford, the state pathologist, called in to examine the remains, would later describe her findings in language that struggled to remain scientific. The bodies showed no signs of traditional preservation techniques, no evidence of chemical treatment, no indication of mummification or embalming. Yet they had resisted decomposition for decades, maintaining their basic human form in ways that challenged everything she knew about death and decay. Temperature readings inside the barn revealed nothing unusual. The air was neither particularly dry nor humid. The temperature fluctuated normally with the seasons, and soil samples from beneath the floorboards showed no unusual chemical composition. By all scientific measurements, the environment inside the barn should have accelerated decomposition rather than prevented it. Yet here were over 100 bodies that had somehow escaped the natural processes that claimed all organic matter. Even more disturbing were the personal effects found with each family: pocket watches that had stopped at different times, jewelry that remained untarnished, photographs that showed no signs of age or deterioration. It was as if time itself moved differently within the barn's wooden walls, following rules that existed outside the normal flow of cause and effect. Dr. Ashford's attempts to remove tissue samples for laboratory analysis met with unexpected resistance. The preserved flesh had developed a consistency unlike anything in her experience. Not quite leather, not quite wood, but something entirely new. When she finally managed to extract small specimens, they crumbled to dust within hours of being removed from the barn's environment, as if exposure to normal air and light broke whatever force had maintained their preservation. The mystery deepened when investigators discovered that some bodies showed signs of having been added to the collection, years apart. Carbon dating of clothing and personal effects revealed that some families had been placed in the barn decades before others, yet all showed identical levels of preservation. It was as if the barn existed in its own temporal bubble, where the normal rules of aging and decay simply didn't apply. Local folklore offered its own explanations, stories passed down through generations about the strange practices of the Grayson family, about rituals conducted under new moons, and bargains made with forces that demanded payment in human lives. But science found no evidence of supernatural intervention, no trace of the occult practices that whispered tales suggested. What remained was a collection of perfectly preserved families, arranged like specimens in some vast, incomprehensible museum. Their bodies maintained in a state that challenged every scientific principle, their preservation so complete that investigators could still identify individuals from missing person reports filed decades earlier. But the most chilling aspect of the discovery wasn't the unnatural preservation itself. It was the growing realization that these bodies had been arranged with care, positioned as if they were sleeping rather than dead, laid to rest by someone who viewed them not as victims but as treasured additions to an ever-growing collection. The official discovery of the preserved bodies brought investigators from across the state, but it also loosened the tongues of locals who had carried dark knowledge for decades. Suddenly, people who had remained silent for years began sharing stories that painted a picture far more terrifying than any official report could capture. These weren't tales told for entertainment or attention. They were confessions, desperate attempts to unburden souls that had carried fear for too long. Martha Henley, who had lived on the neighboring property for 60 years, was among the first to come forward. Her hands shook as she described nights when she'd been awakened by sounds drifting across the fields from the Grayson barn. Not the normal creaking of old wood or the scurrying of small animals, but something that sounded almost like singing. Hymns, she thought at first, until she realized the melodies were wrong, twisted into shapes that made her skin crawl and her heart race. It wasn't church music, she told investigators, her voice barely above a whisper. It was something that used church music, like a wolf wearing sheep's clothing. The words were familiar, but the tune was all bent and broken, turned into something that hurt to hear. I'd stuff cotton in my ears and pull the covers over my head, but it would go on, for hours sometimes, that horrible singing echoing across the fields. Samuel Wright, a traveling salesman who had passed the Grayson property monthly for over 2 decades, provided his own disturbing testimony. He described seeing lights in the barn windows during his nighttime travels, flickering illumination that moved in patterns too deliberate to be caused by wind or settling wood. More disturbing were the shadows he glimpsed moving past those windows, tall figures that seemed to glide rather than walk, shapes that suggested human forms but moved with an unnatural fluidity. I saw them arranging things inside, Wright told investigators, his voice growing stronger as he spoke, as if sharing the burden made it easier to bear. Through the gaps in the boards, you could make out figures moving back and forth like they were organizing something, setting things in place. At first I thought it was just farmhands working late, but farmhands don't work in perfect silence, and they don't move like that, like they were floating just above the ground. Perhaps the most chilling testimony came from young Timothy Morrison, now grown but still haunted by childhood memories from the early 1920s. As a boy of 8, he had dared to approach the barn on a dare from older children, creeping close enough to peer through a gap in the wooden walls. What he saw inside had given him nightmares for the rest of his life. They were all just lying there, he said, his adult voice cracking with the emotion of a frightened child. Families laying in rows like they were sleeping, but their eyes were open and they weren't breathing. I could see their chests perfectly still, but their eyes followed me as I moved past the opening. They were aware, those people. They knew I was there, but they couldn't move or speak or do anything but watch. Timothy's account was corroborated by other children who had taken the same dare over the years, each describing similar scenes of aware but immobilized figures arranged within the barn's interior. The consistency of their stories, told independently and decades apart, lent credence to claims that seemed impossible to believe. Even more disturbing were the accounts from families who had almost worked for the Graysons but changed their minds at the last moment. The Patterson family had traveled from Georgia in 1903, drawn by promises of steady work and fair wages. But something about Ezekiel Grayson himself had troubled Mary Patterson, a coldness in his eyes, a way of speaking that made her feel like livestock being appraised rather than a person being hired. He kept staring at our children, she remembered, measuring them with his eyes like he was calculating something. And when he showed us the cabin where we'd be living, he spent more time pointing out the barn than discussing our work duties. Said we'd need to help with special harvests when the time was right. Something about the way he said it made my blood run cold. The Pattersons left that same day, despite having traveled hundreds of miles for the opportunity. Mary Patterson later said it was the best decision she ever made, though she never forgot the disappointed look in Ezekiel Grayson's eyes when she announced their departure. It was the look, she said, of a collector who had just lost a prized addition to his collection. These testimonies began to paint a picture of the barn not as a storage facility, but as something far more sinister, a place where the boundaries between life and death had been deliberately blurred, where families weren't just killed but preserved in some hellish state of aware suspension. Among the most damning evidence discovered at the Grayson Homestead was a leather-bound ledger found hidden beneath loose floorboards in the main house. The book, its pages yellowed with age but remarkably well preserved, contained what appeared to be meticulous records spanning nearly 50 years. At first glance, investigators assumed they'd found simple farm accounts, records of wages paid, supplies purchased, crops harvested. But closer examination revealed entries that made their blood run cold. Each family that had worked on the Grayson property was listed by name, along with detailed information that went far beyond normal employment records. Heights and weights were recorded for every family member, including small children. Eye color, hair texture, and distinguishing marks were noted with scientific precision. Most disturbing of all were the dates, not just when families were hired, but when they were collected, a term that appeared again and again throughout the ledger's pages. The entries were written in multiple hands, beginning with Jeremiah, Grayson's elaborate script, and continuing through what appeared to be his son, Ezekiel's more utilitarian penmanship. But regardless of who had made the entries, the format remained consistent. Family name, number of members, physical descriptions, hire date, and finally collection date. The time between hiring and collection ranged from 6 weeks to several months, but no family's employment appeared to have ended in any other way. More chilling still were the symbols that accompanied each entry. Families whose names were followed, by simple cross marks seemed to correspond with the oldest bodies found in the barn, those that had been preserved the longest. But later entries featured increasingly complex symbols, intertwined circles, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, and designs that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed peripherally. Dr. Helena Morse, a professor of comparative religion brought in to analyze the symbols, recognized elements from various occult traditions but could find no exact matches in known texts. These appear to be hybrid symbols, she reported, combining elements from different mystical traditions in ways that suggest the creator was attempting to achieve something specific, possibly related to preservation or suspension of natural processes. The ledger's final entries, dating to 1932, showed an evolution in the record-keeping that suggested growing sophistication in whatever process the Graysons were conducting. Later families were categorized by physical characteristics and arranged in what appeared to be deliberate groupings. Children were sorted by age and size, adults by profession and health status, as if they were being prepared for specific purposes. But it was the ledger's final page that left investigators sleepless. Written in Ezekiel Grayson's careful script, dated just 2 years before the barn's discovery, were the words that would haunt everyone who read them. Collection complete, all specimens secured. The arrangement may now proceed as planned. Time will tell if the preservation holds through the final transformation. Below this entry, in different ink and shakier handwriting, someone had added a final note. They are ready. They have always been ready. Soon they will wake, and the harvest will begin anew. Today, if you drive down the old county road that winds through rural Alabama, you'll find the Grayson Homestead still standing, though it bears little resemblance to the working farm it once pretended to be. The main house has collapsed into itself, its timbers rotted and scattered by decades of neglect. The tenant cabins have been reclaimed by kudzu and time, their red doors and yellow flower gardens now nothing more than local legend. But the barn remains. State authorities sealed the structure in 1935, boarding up its windows and chaining its doors shut with heavy locks that rust but never break. No official historical markers commemorate the site. The county has made no effort to preserve or document what happened here. There are no tours, no museum displays, no acknowledgement that this place ever held significance beyond its function as a simple farm building. Yet the barn endures, and with it the questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. Local children still dare each other to approach it after dark, though few have the courage to complete the challenge. Those who do report the same phenomenon their grandparents described, a sense of awareness emanating from within the sealed structure, as if something inside continues to watch and wait. On certain nights when the moon is dark and the air hangs still, residents of the surrounding area report seeing a faint glow seeping through the boards that cover the barn's windows. They hear sounds that might be settling wood or might be something else entirely. Soft movements, whispered conversations, the rustle of bodies shifting position after decades of imposed stillness. The official records state that all human remains were removed from the barn and given proper burial in the county cemetery, but local folks know better than to trust official records when it comes to the Grayson place. They know that some things refuse to stay buried, that some hungers transcend death itself. The Grayson homestead doesn't rot. They whisper in the gathering darkness, and neither do those who enter it. The barn stands silent now, its terrible collection sealed away from curious eyes. But silence and emptiness are not the same thing. In that place where time moves differently and death waits patiently, something continues to preserve what should have returned to dust long ago. The question that haunts these hills isn't whether the barn still contains its collection. It's what that collection is waiting for, and whether the locks and chains that seal it away are meant to keep people out, or to keep something else in.